Lesson 5 is about the writing process itself, writing the business message. Obviously, this could be for a written communication or it could be for an oral communication when you're writing a script. The first thing in terms of writing, obviously, it's the question of having English skills, and writing skills is kind of a prerequisite to everything. But let's start with being sensitive to the needs of the audiences. In other words, being sensitive to what the audience needs to hear, what they need to understand. And that starts with one idea. This is not the only way to do it, but one idea of establishing a rapport with your audience is to establish the fact that you are communicating directly with the other party. Using you pronouns, like saying, this is what you need, and this is what you need to know, and this is how you deal with. Showing interest in your audience. You are potential customers. You are potential people that may have ideas. You're potential producers for this company. Respect cultural preferences. If people want to be sometimes, in again certain cultures, as we discussed in the previous chapter, people want to be referred to more formally. Don't be presumptuous and use people's first names unless you know them well enough to make that acceptable. And of course, adhere to organizational policies. There may be ways in which different organizations prefer that their people communicate. Maintaining standard of etiquette is all part of this. Respecting your audience. Don't be overly emotional in a negative way if you can. Try to use diplomacy. In other words, try to be tactful. Try not to write things that could be embarrassing for other people. And choose the medium that's best suited for your message. If it's something that is very sensitive, maybe a phone call or even an in-person meeting is appropriate. Whereas if it's something that is appropriate for geared towards large number of people, something like a mass email or a presentation that's shared with a lot of people might be just as appropriate. Emphasizing the positive is an important skill that it's easier said than done, because sometimes the writer of messages frustrated or needs to put together something very strongly, and negative emotions put together a strong message or convey a strong message more than positive emotions. But nevertheless, it helps with getting the reader to be on your side and getting the reader to understand and appreciate your message if you're going to try to avoid using negative language. Focus on opportunities for improvement, emphasize the benefits for the reader for taking the position that you'd like the reader to take. You can use euphemisms. The euphemism would be not as strong as it could be when you really wanted to say bad, or potentially construed as insensitive when you wanted to convey insensitive. You can kind of use those language that implies what you mean when you don't want to, when you try to want to be a little less harsh. In conveying message in terms of this kind of sensitivity, you want to try to be as bias free as possible. Gender bias, if you're always using he and never using he or she or anything like that, that could be construed as sexist. Racial or ethnic bias, if you don't want to, or age bias, you don't want to. In examples, you don't want to use things that indicate based on race or based on ethnicity. You don't want to use examples that that show the negative being connoted or construed with people of a certain socioeconomic background. This can be tough to do. You really have to look at examples, but it's the sort of thing you want to be careful about, not to try to make sure that you're not negatively stereotyping a particular group of people. Okay, building strong how do you build a relationship with your audience? Obviously, it's not going to be that much of a give or take in a one-way communication, but you can still build a rapport to the point where your audience trusts you and your audience thinks that you're reliable. Honesty, objectivity, trying to make sure that you don't come off as being biased in one way or another, especially if you're trying to inform and not trying to persuade. If you're trying to persuade, obviously you're going to be biased in some respects. You're going to be biased in favor of your idea and against not your idea. But in other things, and things that there might be differences of opinion, You want to try to make sure that you don't come off as biased, the awareness of what the audience need, and of course to establish your own credentials. Why are you an expert in this field? Have you been out in the field working on this constantly? You may want to say that in order to establish the fact that you're trustworthy in this particular type of case. How do you establish your own credibility? Endorsements by other people. The president of the company agrees with this, or this idea has been floated and accepted in the past by other companies. Performance. This idea has worked in this and that and the other thing, in this, that, and the other context. And sincerity, to establish that you're not just trying to grease skids, you're actually trying to do what's best for the company. The more you can you don't want to say, I am sincere. But you want to establish it by your research, by your style, by your the amount of arguments you put forth in favor of your proposal. You want to try to protect your company's image by appropriate style and guidelines. You send messages to potential customers or potential colleagues that are unprofessional or in poor style, that obviously could hurt your company's image. So that's really about style and tone. What are some of the things that are important with regard to style and tone? Understand the difference between texting and writing, just not only in terms of things like writing the letter U instead of YOU or anything like that. That's one thing, obviously. But texting it's more acceptable to be short and to have not appropriate punctuation, and you don't have to worry so much about sentence structure. But when you're writing, it should you should, for example, sometimes you see people email and they think they're texting and they don't bother to use capitalization and they don't bother to use punctuation. You don't want to do that. When you're writing something that's formal, when you're writing something in a business perspective, use capitalization appropriately, use grammar appropriately, avoid preaching, avoid bragging. I think this is the best idea because without this, our company would be in serious trouble and blah, blah, blah. Or, I was the top salesman the last 2 years and I have the right to know and all that. You can establish your credentials without making them sound like you're bragging, because if you're bragging, people naturally get defensive, and you want to try to avoid that if they're going to understand what's going on. Be careful with intimacy. Again, that just means making sure not to be presumptuous and not to make an assumption that you're buddy-buddy with the person that you're writing to, unless you know for sure that that's true. Be careful with humor. A little bit of humor is good, but you don't want to be over the top or be insensitive or make the joke the primary message that you're establishing. That takes away from being funny helps captivate the reader's attention, but it also risks, if you do it too much, the humor or the joke being the message rather than what you're trying to establish. I've been seeing situations where you're talking about, let's say in teaching, where a joking here and there is great. Certainly a little humor is good, but on the other hand, I've seen teaching auditions where people have had the entire lesson be riddled with jokes, and then there's at some point, it's not stand-up comedy. You are trying to convey a message, and if there's a joke at the beginning and a joke at the end and a couple of little lines here in the middle just to captivate the reader's attention, that's great. But if it's one joke after another, you're distracting people, and it seems like you're trying to be entertaining rather than trying to convey the ideas. Plain language. Plain language means not using legalese or not using overly technical jargon, which you think could confuse people. Using plain language helps the audience grasp what you're talking about, shows the you attitude because you're helping the reader understand things. You're a doctor, use heavily scientific terms. When the target of your audience is not other doctors, people are not going to relate. You're not going to relate to people as well as possible. You're also showing respect for your audience, not by using, monosyllabic words, but by using words that they can understand, and by using words that help convey the message rather than showing, oh, look, I've got a fancy education, I know all these 12-syllable words. You're not really helping your audience. It's like you're writing for yourself rather than writing for the benefit of your audience. And of course, it goes without saying that it increases productivity, because the more people that can actually understand you, the easier it will be to convey your message, and it helps diverse audience who may not be as fluent in your language as you are. Then we've got active voice versus passive voice. Generally speaking, you want to use the active voice as much as possible. You want to use verbs. Things are happening rather than being done. You lost the shipment versus the shipment was lost. If you're trying to be diplomatic, you might use the passive voice to avoid insulting people, so to speak. The new procedure was developed by the operations team, not as good as the operations team developed the new procedure. The latter is more active, the former is more passive. Legal problems are created by this contract, kind of flat. The contract creates legal problems, is more concise, and it's more active. A better way of doing things. Again, on the bottom you have some examples where using the passive voice kind of takes the sting out of your criticism a little bit, in which case it might be justified for that reason. You want powerful words, strong words, effective sentences, sentences that convey ideas properly, paragraphs that are independent, that don't meander from topic to topic. You certainly don't want to have one paragraph that tries to convey a whole bunch of different ideas. You've got words that connote, and you've got words that denote. Both connote and denote, connoting something and denoting something, are both mechanisms by which you imply something, but they have a little bit of a difference. When something is denoted, you're going from general to specific. It is explicit. You're specifically stating what the actual definition of the word is. Denotation is the literal meaning of a word, as opposed to the feelings or the underlying ideas behind the definition. If I say, for example, it's rainy weather outside, the denotation is that it's raining or that it's cloudy or whatever it is. It's part of the definition, whereas connotation is the idea that the word invokes in addition to what it specifically means. Saying that it's rainy weather outside, you might say, okay, well, then it's not a good idea to go for a picnic or something like that. It's more of an implication. Both of them can be used. Both of these strategies can be used, taking one thing to imply something else. Denote is simply it's specific, it's explicit in the word. You don't have to make really an implication what something means. Again, you can use both in different contexts, but each one serves its own purpose. You are denoting something when you're trying to show something is literally true. So you have another fact that denotes some particular set of circumstances, whereas a connotative word is just basically an implication. You can also use abstract words or concrete words. Concrete words are much more specific and specifically imply something, whereas abstract words are more general, concepts, characteristics. Abstract words may be things like, dedication or, fear or generosity, something like that. Again, things that are implied by other actions, but need some sort of a stretch. You can say, for example, that somebody's an honest person. Well, that's not concrete. Honest person means somebody told the truth. Joan told the truth. Told is a concrete word. It's something that happened. Joan is an honest person. That's an abstract concept. It may be justified. Hopefully it is justified. You want your abstractions to be justified by concrete words. But abstraction should be, the point is that abstract concepts should be justified by concrete words. When you say something abstract, that person is bad, that person is humble, that person has a sense of humor, that person is jealous, that person is immature, that person is talented, something like trustworthy, wise. All these things are ideas, concepts that you want them to be proven, or at least shown to be true, by specific facts, figures, numbers, arguments, whatever the case may be. You want to choose words that are strong and precise, not words that have many different possible meanings in which you're asking the reader to guess. Avoid cliches and buzzwords. Never say die. It ain't over till it's over. These are fine for sports broadcasts, but they're not the sorts of things that you want to use in formal writing. It just sounds trite and it just doesn't sound appropriate in terms of conveying information. It sounds lazy actually when you use cliches, because it means that you don't want to think about how to convey your own message. So you're having somebody else that that established the cliche convey the message for you. And it may or may not actually apply to your case, because when the person wrote the expression originally, it probably wasn't written for your situation specifically anyway. Okay, choose words that people will understand, etc. Um, Different types of sentences. What you don't want, of course, is a run-on sentence. You don't want a sentence that has more than one distinct idea. You within as long as it's not a run-on. A sentence could be long, by the way, without being a run-on. Although you don't want to you want to try to avoid having long sentences if at all possible because they're hard to understand. But what you do want to try to do is at least ensure that the sentence does not have two distinct separate ideas. A sentence could be short and be a run-on, something like John went to the store to buy some milk and then drove home and took a nap. That's a run-on sentence because it has it has two different ideas. John went to the store to buy some milk. Period. Then, comma, John went home and took a nap. That's what it should be. It should be two different sentences. On the other hand, if you say something like John, while carrying $44.93 in his left pocket, drove his his 2012 Chevrolet Impala 4.6 miles to John's Grocery, that wherein a sale was running on milk for $4 a gallon. Whatever, the point is that could be a long sentence, but an appropriate sentence, not a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence contains two different ideas, whereas as long as the different phrases are modifying the same subject, a sentence theoretically could be 40 or 50 words long without being a run-on. A simple sentence has one main clause. Jane went home. The compound sentence could have two main clauses. Jane, who wanted to take a nap, went home. A simple sentence could have objects and phrases, whereas the compound sentence would be joined by a conjunction. A conjunction is something that bridges one part of the sentence to another, usually and, or, yet. Jane was hungry, yet she did not eat the dinner that she was served. That would be an example of a compound sentence. It's an appropriate sentence. It's not, it doesn't have two separate ideas. It has one idea, that she didn't eat the dinner in spite of the fact that she was hungry. In spite of would also probably have been a inappropriate conjunction. In my example, we use the word yet as a conjunction. That's fine. It hooks the two components of the sentence. And as long as one is modifying than the other, and then one sentence is perfectly okay. In fact, it's better than breaking it up into two sentences and making it verbose or making it wordy. You could say like Jane was hungry. Period. In spite of the fact that she was hungry, she didn't eat the meal. It's grammatically correct, but it's not. It's verbose. You'd rather write something that's a little easier. Complex sentence can have one main clause or two main clauses. Again, as we discussed, there's just different ways to write sentences. Either one can be appropriate. Write the one that is not a run-on sentence but is as concise as possible. These are all grammar things that are important to keep out: how to word the ideas, where to place the ideas in prominent places in sentences where they can be, if the main part of the sentence should be either at the outside of the sentence and then it's modified later on, or at the end of the sentence where it's modified the entire time. But if you bury the key idea of the sentence in the middle, you might make it harder to understand. And of course, then we have crafting and unified coherent paragraphs. I personally am a fan of nice and short paragraphs that contain individual ideas. Usually, if a paragraph has more than 5 or 6 sentences, it might be a little bit too long, or it doesn't mean that's an inherent rule, but paragraphs can be ideas. Sometimes I've written many paragraphs with only one sentence. If you're moving on to a different idea, this happened, and then the next paragraph discusses what happened next, or what the analysis from that is, or different arguments, different strategies that you're establishing. There's no inherent reason you can't break them up into more paragraphs. Paragraphs are kind of like bite-sized. The end of a paragraph signals to the reader, okay, now stop, digest what you just heard, and now it's time to move on. Whereas if you have 3 different ideas in one paragraph, the reader might not stop to digest and therefore have trouble understanding what's going on. Reader will probably figure it out, but it'll take longer and be less efficient. In terms of elements of a paragraph, you got topic sentences. Usually the first sentence in the paragraph, not necessarily, but usually the first sentence in the paragraph explains where the paragraph is going, what the purpose of the paragraph is. Support sentences explains what your ideas are and why the topic is presented properly. And then you have transitions, which are transitional words, are words that that go from from one idea to the next. What is the connection between the previous idea and the next one? I mean, some transitional words, for example, are however. However tells you that you made a statement, but we're about to kind of contradict the previous statement by establishing what some exception to that, or consequently, which means as a consequence of what I just said, this is going to happen. Additionally, I'm adding something to what I just said. Moreover, because these are all good transitional words that draw the reader a picture. Okay, why is the previous part of the paragraph or even sentence relevant to what I'm about to discuss now? Okay, there are different ways to develop paragraphs. Illustration, you're illustrating something, you're drawing a verbal picture for the reader. Compare and contrast, you're comparing two different ideas or comparing two different scenarios. Cause and effect, you're explaining why one thing caused the other. Classification, problem and solution, etc. Okay, in terms of writing message for mobile devices, these are important things because people who are on mobile devices don't have they'd rather it's much more important to be concise. It doesn't mean they can't scroll, but people don't like to scroll as much on mobile devices, and the more quickly and concisely you communicate, the better in that kind of a scenario. Use linear organization, prioritize information, write shorter, more focused. Again, use things as quickly, as short as possible, rather than being overly complex or verbose. Okay, so that's all for lesson 5, and we'll see you in lesson